Είσαι ένας γελίος επαρχιώτης.
Πώς τολμάς?
Πώς τολμάς? Θα το μετανιώσεις αυτό.
Beneath glittering chandeliers, an arrogant foreign envoy delivered a vile insult in fluent Greek, assuming the English duke was merely an uncultured brute. Mocking laughter echoed through the ballroom until the duke's quiet, entirely overlooked wife stepped out of the shadows and answered the ambassador perfectly in his own tongue. London in the summer of 1814 was a city suffocating under the weight of its own triumph. The long, exhausting wars on the continent had reached a temporary cessation, and the capital was flooded with allied sovereigns, diplomats, and opportunistic politicians. Beneath the glittering surface of the Prince Regent's endless victory galas, a cutthroat game of territorial division was being played. At the center of this diplomatic chessboard stood Nathaniel Fitzroy, the Duke of Westford. Nathaniel was a man carved from English oak and cold ambition. At 32, he possessed a vast fortune, immense political influence within the War Office, and a reputation for being as unyielding as a fortress wall. He was a pragmatist who viewed the world in terms of leverage and liability. When it had come time to secure an heir and a hostess for his sprawling estates, he had applied the same cold calculus. He did not want a fiery, demanding debutante who would drain his time and energy. He required a woman of impeccable breeding, quiet demeanor, and absolute discretion. He found exactly what he sought in Lady Diana Harrington. To the ruthless matriarchs of the ton, Diana was a non-entity. At 22, she was considered entirely too old to be a prime catch, possessing a quiet, understated beauty that was easily overshadowed by the flamboyant belles of the season. She was the only daughter of Lord Philip Harrington, the Earl of Merivale, a man who had notoriously squandered the majority of his family's liquid wealth on a maniacal obsession with antiquities and classical history. Lord Merivale had effectively locked his daughter away in his crumbling countryside estate, surrounded by marble busts and crumbling manuscripts, leaving society to assume the girl was as dusty and dull as her father's collections. Their courtship had been a masterclass in aristocratic efficiency. Nathaniel had offered to settle her father's crippling debts. In exchange, Diana would become the Duchess of Westford. They had spoken perhaps 5 times before standing at the altar of St. George's, Hanover Square. 6 months into their marriage, they operated like 2 elegant ships passing in the fog. Nathaniel spent his days locked in tense negotiations with Lord Castlereagh and his knights navigating the treacherous waters of Parliament. Diana managed his households with flawless, quiet efficiency. She never demanded his attention, never threw tantrums over his long absences, and never embarrassed him. Nathaniel considered it the most successful negotiation of his life. He respected her, provided for her, and fiercely protected her, but he did not truly know her. He did not know, for instance, that while Lord Merivale had neglected his estate, he had poured his eccentricity into his daughter's mind. Recognizing Diana's eidetic memory, the Earl had subjected her to a rigorous, university-level education that would have scandalized Regency society. By the time she was 16, Diana was fluently translating Homeric epics, debating the philosophical nuances of the Roman Senate in Latin, and corresponding with scholars in Constantinople in modern Greek. She possessed an intellect sharper than most of the men sitting in the House of Lords, but she had learned early on to hide it. Men of the ton despised blue stockings. To survive in society, Diana had wrapped herself in a cloak of pleasant, agreeable silence. She played the part of the decorative duchess perfectly, until the night the Prince Regent hosted his grand fete for the diplomatic corps. Carlton House was a sensory overload of gilded molding, hot wax, and the overwhelming scent of imported jasmine. The room was packed with military uniforms, dripping with medals, and silk gowns shimmering with jewels. Nathaniel stood near a towering column of faux lapis lazuli, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand, his sharp eyes tracking the movements of the foreign delegates. Diana stood a half step behind him, her posture perfect, her face arranged in an expression of polite serenity. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that contrasted strikingly with her pale skin and dark hair, though she kept her gaze demurely lowered. To the outside observer, she was merely a shadow tethered to the great Duke. Castlereagh is being entirely too soft on the Mediterranean issue, Nathaniel murmured, speaking more to himself than to his wife. If we yield control of the Ionian ports, we lose the trade routes to the Levant. Perhaps, Diana said softly, her voice barely carrying over the swell of the orchestra. Lord Castlereagh believes yielding the smaller ports will force a concession on the mainland borders. Nathaniel glanced at her, mildly surprised. It was a remarkably astute observation. Before he could inquire how she knew about the mainland border disputes, information that was not exactly public knowledge, the crowd parted to admit a small, highly decorated contingent of diplomats. At their head was Comte Charles Marie de Valmont. Comte de Valmont was a man who wore his aristocratic arrogance like a second skin. Representing the newly restored Bourbon monarchy of France, Valmont was deeply involved in the intricate negotiations regarding naval dominance in the Mediterranean. He was notoriously difficult, famously snobbish, and harbored a deep, venomous disdain for the English, whom he considered uncultured, pragmatic brutes who had only won the war through sheer, stubborn luck. Valmont possessed a razor-sharp tongue and a habit of verbally eviscerating his opponents in languages they could not understand, much to the amusement of his sycophantic aides. He was particularly fond of parading his classical education, believing it elevated him above the merchant lords of Britain. Spotting Nathaniel, Valmont's lips curled into a predatory smile. He adjusted the sash across his chest and marched directly toward the Duke, trailed by two junior attachés. "Ah, the formidable Duke of Westford," Valmont drawled in heavily accented English, executing a shallow mocking bow. "I was hoping to find you tonight, though I see you are hiding in the corners, away from the dancing. Avoiding the culture, as usual." Nathaniel's expression remained entirely impassive. "I find that dancing, Comte, is much like your country's foreign policy, a great deal of spinning in circles only to end up exactly where you started." A few nearby courtiers, including the formidable Russian ambassador's wife, Princess Dorothea Levin, stifled amused laughs. Valmont's smile tightened, his dark eyes flashing with irritation. "You English," Valmont replied smoothly, switching effortlessly to rapid, flawless French, assuming it would give him the upper hand. "Always so focused on the dreary business of trade, you lack the poetry of statesmanship. You view the Mediterranean merely as a ledger of ships and cargo, blind to the historical soul of the region." Nathaniel, who spoke French perfectly well, did not miss a beat. "I find that poetry does not feed starving populations, Comte, nor does it secure borders against piracy. We prefer ledgers because they deal in facts, not romantic delusions." Valmont's jaw clenched. He hated being matched in a verbal duel, especially by an Englishman. He glanced dismissively at Diana, who was standing quietly at Nathaniel's side, her eyes focused politely on the Comte's lapel. To Valmont, she was the epitome of the English aristocracy's fatal flaw: pale, uninteresting, and entirely decorative. A brainless porcelain doll. Determined to have the last word and humiliate Nathaniel in front of his giggling aides, Valmont decided to deploy his favorite weapon. He knew that while the English nobility might manage French and Italian, their grasp of Greek, especially the fast-paced, conversational Greek of the Eastern courts, was non-existent. It was an exclusive language of elite Mediterranean diplomacy, one Valmont had spent years mastering during his time in Athens. Leaning slightly toward his attachés, Valmont switched to rapid, biting Greek. "Look at him," Valmont sneered in the ancient tongue, his voice dripping with aristocratic malice, loud enough for those in their immediate circle to hear the strange, melodic syllables. "The great English ox. He stands here puffing out his chest, completely unaware that his beloved government is about to be outmaneuvered in the Ionian Straits. They have no culture, these islanders, only gunpowder and greed." The attachés snickered, shooting smug, knowing glances at Nathaniel. The Duke's jaw tightened. He knew he was being insulted, but the language was entirely alien to him. The sudden shift in power was palpable. The surrounding nobles leaned in, sensing the tension, whispering behind their fans as Nathaniel stood in stoic, frustrated silence. Valmont was not finished. Emboldened by Nathaniel's inability to comprehend him, the Comte's gaze swept over Diana, his eyes raking her up and down with blatant disgust. "And the wife," Valmont continued in Greek, letting out a harsh, cruel laugh. "Look at this pathetic creature, a dull, witless cow wrapped in expensive silk. I wager there is nothing between her ears but thoughts of embroidery and the weather. A fittingly barren and useless accessory for a man with the intellect of a stone." The attachés laughed louder this time. Nathaniel's hands balled into fists at his sides. Though he could not translate the words, the predatory look in Valmont's eyes as he stared at Diana was unmistakable. Nathaniel took a half-step forward, his massive frame radiating a sudden, lethal violence. To insult his politics was one thing. To insult his wife in his presence was a matter of blood. "I suggest you translate that, Valmont," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low, gravelly timbre. Valmont feigned innocence, raising his hands in a gesture of mock apology, switching back to English. "Oh, forgive me, Your Grace. I was merely remarking to my colleagues in Greek, a language of true scholars, on the splendid beauty of your Duchess's gown. I sometimes forget how limited the English curriculum is." Nathaniel's eyes were cold enough to freeze hell. He was calculating the political fallout of dragging the French envoy out to the terrace and breaking his jaw. But before Nathaniel could move, before he could demand satisfaction, a soft, musical sound cut through the heavy tension. It was a laugh. It came from Diana. The sound was so foreign, so entirely out of character for the quiet, demure Duchess of Westford, that the entire circle of diplomats and aristocrats froze. Nathaniel turned to his wife, stunned. Diana did not look at her husband. She stepped out from the shadow of the Duke, her posture shifting perfectly from that of a submissive wife to the commanding presence of an earl's daughter. She lifted her chin, her striking blue eyes locking onto Valmont with the piercing intensity of a falcon spotting prey. The silence in the room was absolute. Princess Leven had lowered her fan. Lord Castlereagh had paused mid-stride a few feet away. Diana smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was a smile that promised absolute ruin. When she spoke, her voice was not the soft, deferential whisper society was accustomed to. It was clear, resonant, and dripping with an authority that commanded the room. And the words that left her lips were not in English, nor in French. They were in flawless, impeccably accented Greek. "If you are going to insult a man's intellect, Comte de Valmont," Diana said smoothly in the ancient tongue, her pronunciation so perfect it would have brought a tear to an Athenian scholar's eye, "you should first ensure your own is not severely lacking. Your accent is atrocious. You sound like a drunken sailor bartering for fish in a backwater port, not a diplomat of the French court." The color drained from Valmont's face so violently he looked as though he had been physically struck. His attachés choked on their laughter, their mouths dropping open in sheer horror. Nathaniel stared at his wife as if she had suddenly manifested wings. The air in the ballroom seemed to have been entirely sucked away. Diana did not stop. She stepped closer to the trembling French envoy, her eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying fire. She was no longer a wallflower. She was a weapon unsheathed. "You call my husband an ox," she continued in Greek, her voice slicing through the silent ballroom like a freshly honed blade. "Yet this ox has consistently backed your diplomats into corners for the last 3 months, stripping you of your Mediterranean leverage while you were too busy admiring your own reflection to notice. You speak of the poetry of statesmanship while Britain dictates the borders of your empire. And as for me," Diana tilted her head, her gaze sweeping over Valmont with absolute withering disdain. "I may be an English cow, Comte, but I possess enough education to know that a man who hides his insults behind a language he assumes others cannot speak is no statesman at all. He is a coward. Now, I suggest you take your sycophants and your abysmal grasp of grammar out of my husband's sight before I translate this entire conversation into English for the amusement of the Prince Regent." She finished her speech and stood perfectly still, a goddess of vengeance draped in midnight silk. Valmont was paralyzed. His mouth opened and closed silently, resembling the very fish Diana had just compared him to. He had been completely, utterly annihilated in front of the most powerful people in Europe by a woman he had dismissed as an idiot. Slowly, Diana turned her head and looked up at Nathaniel. The Duke was staring at her, his dark eyes wide, a muscle ticking in his jaw. The stoic, unbreakable wall of his composure had completely shattered. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Westford was entirely speechless. Diana offered him a small, utterly serene smile, switching effortlessly back to the king's English. "Forgive me, my lord," she said softly, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the ballroom. "The Comte and I were just having a minor disagreement over classical linguistics." The silence in the Prince Regent's ballroom stretched into an agonizing eternity, hanging heavy and thick over the glittering assembly. Princess Dorothea Leven, never one to let a moment of high drama pass without capitalizing upon it, was the first to break the tableau. She snapped her painted silk fan shut with a sharp crack that echoed like a pistol shot, throwing her head back and releasing a peal of delighted, melodic laughter. "Oh, flawlessly executed, Your Grace," the Russian princess declared, her heavily accented voice carrying over the paralyzed crowd. "Comte de Valmont, it appears the English curriculum is considerably more robust than Paris led you to believe." The spell was broken. A ripple of suppressed snickers erupted into open, mocking laughter from the gathered diplomats. Lord Castlereagh, standing near the punch bowl, raised his crystal glass toward Diana in a silent, deeply respectful salute. The Prince Regent himself, sweating profusely in his corseted uniform, leaned over to whisper gleefully to his equerry. Valmont, his face flushed a mottled, apoplectic purple, looked wildly around the room. The sycophantic aides who had been laughing moments before were now staring at their boots, desperate to distance themselves from their superior's utter humiliation. Stripped of his aristocratic armor and exposed as a fool, the French envoy executed a stiff, jerky bow that lacked any of his previous grace. He turned on his heel and practically fled the ballroom, his attachés scuttling behind him like frightened crabs. Diana watched him retreat, her posture remaining impeccably rigid, the furious fire slowly fading from her blue eyes. When the doors slammed shut behind the French delegation, she finally allowed her gaze to return to her husband. Nathaniel was still staring at her. The predatory stillness that usually defined the Duke of Westford had been replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated shock. He slowly offered her his arm. "I believe, Duchess," Nathaniel murmured, his voice possessing a strange, roughened texture, "it is time we took our leave." "As you wish, Your Grace," Diana replied softly, placing her gloved hand upon his sleeve. They navigated the crowded ballroom in silence, the sea of aristocrats parting for them with a newfound, almost fearful reverence. The murmurs followed them out into the warm London night, a tidal wave of gossip that would inevitably consume the capital by morning. The journey back to their Mayfair townhouse was suffocatingly quiet. The carriage wheels clattered loudly against the cobblestones, the rhythmic sound amplifying the tension inside the velvet-lined cabin. Nathaniel sat in the shadows, his long legs stretched out, his intense gaze fixed upon his wife. Diana looked out the window, watching the gas lamps flicker past, her hands folded primly in her lap. She braced herself for the inevitable reprimand. She had drawn attention. She had broken the cardinal rule of their arrangement by stepping out of the shadows. "Greek," Nathaniel said suddenly, the single word shattering the heavy silence. "You speak fluent Greek." Diana did not turn her head. "I do." "And French, I presume, given your comprehension of his initial insults?" "And Latin. And Italian," Diana added quietly. "My father, Lord Merivale, considered modern languages a frivolous pursuit, but he insisted I master the classical tongues before I was allowed to ride a horse." Nathaniel leaned forward, the faint light from the carriage lanterns illuminating the sharp, aristocratic planes of his face. "You have been in my house for 6 months. You have sat quietly at my dinner table while foreign dignitaries discussed sensitive treaties in French and Italian. Assuming you were entirely ignorant, you understood every word." "I did," she admitted, finally turning to meet his gaze. "You required a quiet, unobtrusive wife, Nathaniel. Society despises a woman with an education. They label her a blue stocking, a grotesque anomaly. My father's debts made my marriage prospects fragile enough. I learned early that silence was my greatest asset. I gave you exactly what you purchased." Nathaniel flinched slightly at the word purchased, the cold pragmatism of their arrangement suddenly leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, realizing with a sudden sharp clarity that he had spent 6 months living with a stranger. He had thought he possessed a beautiful, empty vessel. Instead, he had unknowingly married a master strategist, a woman possessing an intellect that rivaled his own. "You did not give me what I purchased, Diana," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant rumble. "You shortchanged me. You hid your greatest weapon." Diana's brow furrowed in confusion. "You are not angry that I made a spectacle of us?" "Angry?" A slow, predatory smile, a genuine one, devoid of his usual political calculations, spread across the Duke's face. "Valmont has been a thorn in my side for 3 months. You didn't just humiliate him, Diana. You politically castrated him in front of the Prince Regent and the Russian ambassador. By tomorrow morning, his influence in this city will be entirely non-existent." He reached across the carriage, his large, warm hand gently covering her folded ones. The contact sent an unexpected shockwave up Diana's arm. "No more hiding," Nathaniel commanded softly, his dark eyes burning with a sudden intense heat. "From now on, you sit beside me, not behind me." The following morning, the atmosphere in the Westford townhouse crackled with an electric, unfamiliar energy. True to Nathaniel's prediction, the morning papers and the endless stream of calling cards confirmed that Valmont was the laughingstock of London. But Nathaniel had no time to revel in the petty gossip of the ton. The final negotiations regarding the Mediterranean ports were scheduled for noon at the War Office. Instead of departing alone, Nathaniel summoned Diana to his private study, a masculine sanctum of leather, tobacco, and towering bookshelves that she had never before been invited to enter. When she walked in, Nathaniel was standing over a massive mahogany table covered in sprawling maps of the Mediterranean Sea and thick, leather-bound diplomatic treaties. "Come here," he ordered, waving her over without looking up. Diana approached the table, her eyes sweeping over the complex geopolitical lines drawn across the Ionian Islands. "Lord Castlereagh is pressuring me to concede the port of Argostoli to the French," Nathaniel explained, his finger tracing a small island off the western coast of Greece. "Valmont claims a historical precedent dating back to the Venetian Republic, arguing that French forces inherited the administrative rights. If we lose Argostoli, our naval supply lines to the Levant are choked." Diana leaned over the table, her sharp mind instantly analyzing the maps. She picked up the French treaty proposal, her eyes skimming the text with practiced speed. "Valmont is citing the Treaty of Campo Formio?" she asked, her brow furrowing. Nathaniel looked at her, entirely unsurprised by her quick comprehension. "Yes. He argues it grants them perpetual administrative authority over the surrounding waters." Diana let out a soft, dismissive scoff. "He is relying on the assumption that none of your clerks can read the original Byzantine land grants that superseded the Venetian claims. Merivale had copies of those manuscripts in his library. The Venetian administrative rights pertained only to the taxation of the olive harvest, Nathaniel, not naval fortification. In fact, under the old Greek ecclesiastical laws, which the locals still strictly observe, the deep-water harbors were explicitly designated as neutral sanctuaries." Nathaniel went perfectly still. "Are you certain?" "I translated the text myself when I was 15, Diana replied, her eyes meeting his with unwavering confidence. "If Valmont tries to claim naval dominance based on Venetian tax law, he is not only wrong, he is attempting to defraud the British Crown using a deliberate mistranslation." Nathaniel stared at her, his mind racing as the pieces clicked into place. A fierce, Almost terrifying pride swelled in his chest. He grabbed his tailored jacket from a nearby chair. "Get your cloak," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "My cloak? Where are we going?" "To the War Office. You are going to explain exactly that to Lord Castlereagh." The arrival of the Duchess of Westford at the heavily guarded War Office caused a scandalized stir, but Nathaniel bulldozed past the protesting clerks with Diana securely on his arm. When they entered the grand mahogany boardroom, Castlereagh, several high-ranking naval officers, and a deeply diminished Comte de Valmont were already seated. Valmont visibly paled when Diana walked into the room. "Your Grace," Castlereagh said, rising from his chair, clearly bewildered. "This is a highly classified military negotiation. The Duchess cannot possibly—" "The Duchess," Nathaniel interrupted smoothly, pulling out a chair for his wife at the center of the table, "is acting as my primary historical consultant regarding the Ionian territorial claims." Diana seated herself with perfect poise, folding her hands on the polished wood. She looked directly at Valmont, offering him a pleasant, terrifying smile. For the next hour, the boardroom belonged entirely to Diana. When Valmont weakly attempted to present his Venetian precedent, Diana systematically and ruthlessly dismantled his argument. She quoted Byzantine naval law from memory, cited specific Greek ecclesiastical decrees, and pointed out the glaring, deliberate translation errors in the French proposal. The naval officers listened in stunned, reverent silence. Castlereagh's initial skepticism morphed into deep, predatory satisfaction. Valmont, completely outmatched and outmaneuvered, could only sit in sweating, silent defeat as his entire Mediterranean strategy collapsed into dust. By the time the meeting concluded, the British had secured unquestioned control of the ports. As they walked back out into the bright London sunlight, Nathaniel stopped on the stone steps of the War Office. He turned to his wife, ignoring the bustling crowds of Whitehall. The sun caught the dark strands of her hair, and Nathaniel realized that she was the most magnificent creature he had ever laid eyes upon. The cold, calculating Duke who had married for convenience was dead. In his place stood a man utterly, irrevocably devoted to his brilliant wife. "You," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with raw emotion, "are an absolute menace to the French Empire." Diana smiled, stepping closer to him, the lingering shadows of the wallflower completely banished. "Only when they insult my husband, your Grace." If you love this story of a brilliant woman putting an arrogant diplomat in his place, make sure to hit that like button. We upload thrilling, true-to-life historical dramas just like this every single week. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow history buffs and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on the greatest untold stories of the past. Leave a comment below telling us what historical era we should cover next.